Hi all, our instructive game today will have the theme of the Octopus Knight. To demonstrate this theme, I'm choosing the game Anatoly Karpov vs Garry Kasparov, played in the Moscow World Championship of 1985. So Karpov playing white, he played e4, and Kasparov played his favourite Sicilian defence. After knight f3, e6 was played, which is known as the Paulsen variation. After d4, we see some standard opening moves now, with knight b5 being played. And after d6, Karpov could have played for a Shevchnikov variation transposition with bishop f4, but instead he chooses the Maroczy bind. So he's trying to reduce black counterplay and discourage black from playing a later d5, which would liberate black's position. Kasparov turned the tables in this game strategically because he introduced an element of a very powerful knight, which had a paralysing influence on the whole of white's position, as we'll see. So after knight c3, a6, the white knight went back to a3, and normally these knights can later reroute quite powerfully in the centre with, say, knight c2 to e3, so white will increase that grip on d5. Kasparov wasn't having any of it in this game. He plays what it became known as the Kasparov Gambit. He played d5, and one of the points of d5 is that later these bishops can be both liberated to quite aggressive squares after the opening. After c takes d5, e takes d5, e takes d5. So black is a pawn down. But what is black up to here? There's a surprise element of the position. Black plays knight b4, and in this particular position, knight b4 is okay. It's going to actually go to d3 later, believe it or not, especially the way Karpov played it. After bishop e2, bishop c5, black is already getting some nice compensation with these active bishops, and this pressure on f2 is also quite evident. After castles, bishop f3 was played, and maybe there's better moves. This is the start of the end for Karpov. He starts to get quite a paralysed position by playing bishop f3, because he's let the eye off the d3 square. So Kasparov simply reinforces the d3 square with that knight coming there later by playing bishop f5. Now after bishop g5, we'll see now that black played rook e8, so he's intensifying potential pressure into white's position. After queen d2, b5 was played, so black is also stopping white from playing knight c4 here, which might be quite handy. So this bishop and knight is also stopping knight c2, so this is quite an annoyance for white that he can't develop these knights back in the centre. After rook ad1, finally the knight goes to d3, and we see now the main theme of the game. This octopus knight is controlling so many squares, and these knights are not really particularly good. This knight is hemmed in at the moment by its own pawn, and is one of the better ones, but this atrocious knight here is really difficult to get back in the game here. And black's also threatening b4. Now let's see, why did white play now knights back to c2? Why not back to c2? In the game, knight b1 was played, which seems an appalling move. But if knight c2, let's have a quick look at this. Maybe this is better than the game, but black would have knight takes b2, so it would be a pawn sacrifice by white, but maybe this was better than the game. After de1, rook de1, knight c4 though, and according to Rybka, black is much better here. So this knight would be great on c4 instead, protected by that pawn on b5. So Karpov decided to retreat his knight on a3, his problem knight, back to b1. And we see now a great contrast between these two knights. This one is powerfully in the centre, and this one on the edge with little prospects. But furthermore, Kasparov is now chasing away white's active pieces. He plays now h6. So what is happening with this bishop? It goes to h4, and now Kasparov plays b4. So this knight is being chased on the rim as well, because Karpov plays knight a4. And what a picture we're starting to see of these knights versus black's knights, which have easily access to the centre. After bishop d6, both these knights are kind of trapped. They haven't got any good squares. Bishop g3 was played, and after rook c8, black's rooks are also storming down these files. So we have such a contrast in the power of both sides' pieces. b3 was played, perhaps with the idea of knight b2, but after g5, black shows aggressive attentions on the king side as well now, tying white down on this side of the board too. Bishop takes d6, relieves white of one of his active pieces. After queen takes d6 though, Karpov's idea was to play now g3 and fianchetto back his bishop to g2. So g3, and now knight d7 was played. So with this, the black queen can come to f6 to further intensify pressure on that f2 square. Bishop g2, queen f6. And now Karpov did a little desperate undermining move. Kasparov simply reinforced b4 with a5. And after a takes b, just a takes b. So Karpov is left with this very passive position. His fianchetto manoeuvre hasn't really given him much. He now plays queen a2 with the idea of vacating that d2 square to be able to play knight d2. But here, in this position, black now plays bishop g6 to be able to answer knight d2 with rook e2, attacking both f2 and also pinning that knight to the queen on a2. So Karpov, in his desperation, he plays d6. So he wants to give up that pawn to be able to play knight d2 without this horrible pressure on f2. Kasparov, though, he leaves the pawn there for a while. He plays simply g4, just strangling white on the king side instead. So it seems Kasparov has totally turned the tables with his opening gambit, and it's white that's in a very, very difficult position with very difficult problems for his pieces. After queen d2, now this pawn is protected simply by black playing the cheeky king g7. So potentially there's also aggressive intentions of h5, h4 and rook h8 if black wants to attack on the king side as well. So Karpov, he had enough. He tries to break out of this bind he's in. He plays f3. But now we see queen takes d6, and after f takes g4, the queen is also very powerful in the centre after this queen d4 check. So king h1, knight f6 now, and black's pieces are all coming to the centre with a devastating effect. Rook f4, and now we see knight e4. So this knight is immune after queen takes d3, but Karpov plays it anyway, allowing just knight f2 check here, winning the white queen. Because after king g1, let's say king g1 here, then just knight h3 check, and if king h1, now here queen takes d3 is winning for black, because of these back row mate weaknesses. So if rook takes d3, rook e1 is crushing. For example, bishop f1, bishop takes d3. So this is a very desperate position. So Karpov has just given up his queen for that knight on d3, the hero of the game. So after knight f2, rook takes f2, bishop takes d3, and black is just materially winning now, but with this small problem of this pin now on the bishop to the queen. He plays actually the amazing queen e3 here to finish the game in real style, because after rook takes d3, he plays here rook c1, and the rooks and knights are really stumbling to protect the white king. So rook takes c3 would result in massive material loss, and Karpov here instead he tries to defend with knight b2, but here we see another amazing move, a knockout blow from Kasparov. He plays queen f2 with the idea of just rook e1 check. So it's like the black pieces are invading on the first rank. Karpov plays knight d2, but after rook takes d1 check, knight takes d1, rook e1, and it's all over. For example, knight f1, and it's mating 2, rook takes f1, bishop takes, queen takes f1, mate. So, what happened in this game? This is an amazing game by Kasparov. So, Karpov resigning here, obviously. Let's have a look in overview and summary at how this octopus knight had such a devastating effect. So we'll go back to move 1. So Sicilian defence, Paulson variation, Maroczy bind, Kasparov having none of it. He breaks immediately out of the bind, creating this possibility of a knight coming to d3. So his bishops are quite aggressive already out of the opening. His bishop allowed to reinforce that knight on d3. And now we see the counterplay of white systematically reduced as black encourages white to stumble his pieces on the queen side and exchange off his active bishop on g3 in this desperate attempt to do a fianchetto manoeuvre, but it's pretty harmless, this fianchetto. So black makes sure that white is clamped down on the queen side, and there's a lot of pressure that he can't even play knight d2 because of rook e2. And then later in this g4, this cramping g4, to be followed by the this king g7, simply protecting the pawn and maybe threatening things like h5. So Karpov, trying to break out his position, ends up losing his queen now after this very powerful centralisation with knight f6 to e4. Karpov had enough, he gave up his queen, but it was a bit in vain after knight f2 check, because after rook takes f2, bishop takes d3, this was now completely lost for white. Queen e3, rook takes d3, and now we see the amazing rook c1. So the queen is immune without further massive loss of material. And after knight b2, we see now queen f2, threatening rook e1 check. So white's piece is just stumbling on the first rank to protect the white king. And Karpov had enough after rook e1, because the continuation would have been like this, with a beautiful mating on f1, with queen takes f1. I hope you enjoyed that game. Please leave any comments on YouTube. Thanks very much.